enough to form a belief that he exists. If I can have just that, just once, then I'll become the most prolific Christian apologist that you've ever met.
Could you say that with regard to this argument, God has kind of come out of the hiding? Because it does seem beautiful to you now, and it does seem magical to you now.
Why is it, indeed, that in the face of all of these supposed evidences, I am just not moved?
Sometimes the journey of faith is not just about God revealing himself to people, but it's about some long, struggle with God.
Just once, just one time. Listen, here I am. And then gone. I could live on that for the rest of my entire life.
Well, hello and welcome to the show. Bit of a special one for you today, a bit different. We are live from Oxford. In fact, we are here in Wycliffe Hall, which is a theological college in Oxford. And you can probably hear a little bit of the background because it's a hot summer's day and we've got the window open. We're here in one of the rooms and it's been generously organised by Max Baker-Hitch, who may make an appearance later on in the show. He's one of the tutors here. But I am joined by Alex O'Connor and Lucas Ruger. And it's wonderful to be able to do this in person. Isn't it nice to actually be here all together?
It is. How novel.
We've all got used to doing things remotely over Skype and Zoom and whatever, but it's great to be here. And again, as ever, if you are watching via YouTube, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel and all the usual things. Plus, subscribe to these guys' channels because it's a fantastic, the way that this sort of cottage industry almost of interesting discussions and conversations between Christians and atheists and people of other worldviews has come together. Let's hear a little bit about how it's all happened for you, Lucas. Tell us about your background and how you got into doing your channel, which is called Deflate. It's an apologetics and sort of evangelism channel, isn't it?
Yes, sure it is. So my name is Lucas, as you said, and I'm originally Swiss, so hence my accent. I'm sorry if I don't mash that well with your lovely British
Sounding good to
me. We've actually lived in Beirut, Lebanon for the past 10 years. And we've built a ministry there with an organization called Steiger International. We're reaching university students, both online and offline. And how the channel came about is actually through like a range of events we started doing at our own house in the living room in cooperation with an atheist club in Beirut, where we brought people together up to, sometimes we would be 25, 30 people cramming into our space to discuss worldview questions. And then people kept saying, well, Lucas, maybe you should go online and do this stuff online. And as COVID hit, that was the final spark to get me out there on the platform.
And what kind of stuff do you tend to put out normally?
Well, I guess I've done quite a couple of responses to Alex. And then at some point last year, my first subscribers told me, well, Lucas, there are other people out there. So maybe you should look out for other stuff. I guess, I still feel like very much a greenhorn or a newcomer to the scene. I'm still learning my way how to do this best. I do like interacting with other people on the platform. At the same time, I'm also just trying to put out stuff that I kind of wrestle with or think through and hope it, in the hope that it helps other people.
And I know you were due to meet in person back in May, but it couldn't happen for various logistical reasons in the end. But so I'm very glad that we were able to bring you together here in Oxford.
So am I.
Yeah.
Thank you for making this happen. Yeah.
No, it's my pleasure and good to have you back again on the show, Alex. The last time you were on, with me at least, was remotely with Bishop Baron O'Connor, which was a great discussion. So how's life treated you in the last year or so then? What you've been up to?
It's been nice. It's been good. I'm not studying anymore. When we first met, I was doing my A levels.
Wow.
Which gives an indication of how long we've been doing this kind of thing. And so it's the first time in my life where I've been not doing YouTube on the side, which is strange because I haven't been uploading as much as people might have expected me to. And indeed, I expected myself to. But I've decided that I needed to take some time to reevaluate the nature of the channel, where it's going in the future, do a lot more in the way of podcasting as well. So I've been planning more long form content, but also I'm hoping to move towards more highly produced, intense, long videos on particular topics rather than keep doing these sort of quick rebuttals, which I think get old quite fast if you keep hearing them from the same person, because it's always good to hear a new approach. And sure, but once I've been doing it for sort of 5-6 years, it starts to feel like it's wearing a bit thin.
Yeah.
So things are a little bit strange at the moment. The channel's a bit in flux.
But obviously,
well.
and you've developed obviously a name for yourself as a strong promoter of veganism as well, and that so where you started with the sort of the atheist sort of thing, obviously you're developing as a person. Your views about philosophical questions and arguments for God have changed over the years as well, haven't you? You've been. I love the way you've been very honest about that journey you've been on.
I try my best. It's even that's kind of getting old. I discovered this problem of animal suffering, and I thought it was incredibly important. So I wanted to sort of make some noise about it. And now I've been talking about it for so long that it's one of the things that I'm known for. It's no longer, oh, you're doing this veganism thing. Yeah. It's like, oh, are you going to go back Alex, to doing this philosophy thing? But there's only sort of so many times that you can say that factory farming is immoral. And so even that, it's like, look, you don't want to keep beating this dead horse, to use a patently non-vegan metaphor, a dead metaphor, dying metaphor, in fact. I just think I think it's a responsibility of a content creator to make sure that the stuff that they're putting out is consistently useful. Yeah, not just rehashing old stuff. But
well, I love the fact that obviously the YouTube age, and particularly I suppose COVID sort of accelerated it, has developed this kind of very fertile, I think, conversation that thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are watching between folks like you, and obviously there are others like Cameron Bertuzzi and Michael Jones, Inspiring Philosophy, and many others who are kind of in this arena, Stephen Woodford. And I've just been watching, and when I started out doing Unbelievable, it was the only thing that really existed in quite this way in some ways, and we were early adopters of podcasting. But I've just loved seeing the way that these conversations have flourished independently. People just getting up there, giving it a go, and then you see this growth and interesting conversation develop.
Is that you taking credit?
That's me saying I was the first. I was here. Yeah, absolutely. No, but you guys are doing it much better than I am these days. Anyway, it's nice to be here in person, and we thought, well, what could we talk about since we're all here? The hiddenness of God is what we decided, because I'm not aware that you've gone into massive depth. I know you've touched on it in various debates yourself, Alex.
Yeah.
And I know it's something that you're interested in talking about. It's a significant objection to theism. And maybe what would be good is to just tell us a little bit, define what this problem is, this objection is. I don't know whether you want to start us off on that one, Lucas, or maybe as you're here to make the case for the hiddenness objection, why don't we start with you, Alex?
Well, divine hiddenness is one of, I think, the few arguments that are available to a strong atheist to try to argue that there is no God. Most atheists I know define themselves as passive atheists, what a lot of people would just call an agnostic. They're just sort of not convinced of this proposition that God exists. And so a lot of the debate consists in argument being put forward and then holes being poked in the argument, which is easier to do, I think, than to produce a worldview to try and defend. If you're just somebody who's able to take arguments for God's existence and poke holes in them, I think you've got a bit of an easier ride. But there are a few things you can do to say that actually maybe God does not exist. And this doesn't commit you to the view that God doesn't exist. You don't have to say that that's what you actually believe. You can still be on the fence, but perhaps you're on the fence because you think there are good arguments this way, good arguments that way. So one good argument that way might be this problem of divine hiddenness. And there are a few different ways to approach it, but it's a fairly intuitive point that if there were a God who existed, and particularly a God who loved us and wanted to enter into a relationship with anybody who was willing and able, it seems surprising, at the very least, that so many people are restricted from experience of or with this God for so much of the time. Now, a lot of people like to think of this as a version of the problem of evil. It basically falls under the same category of why does God allow bad thing to happen? Because, of course, for an atheist, it might not be seen as bad that you don't have a religious experience. But if there were a God who existed and he restricted his presence from human beings, that would be a bad thing. It would be much better if we could all be sort of happily in relation with him all the time. So it's essentially a version of the problem of evil, but it's quite a particular one, and it's quite a potent one, because it's one of the main things that I think causes people to lose their faith. I wouldn't say it's one of these things that sustains atheism argumentatively, it's not brought up so much. But in the experience of a believer who ends up throwing off their faith, it's often because they go through a period of just silence from deaf heaven, as it were, and they don't really know how to make sense of that. Of course, there are ways to try and make sense of this, right? And so historically, people have put forward lots of suggestions as to why it might be that God is hiding his face from us. There might be sort of sufficient moral warrant. It might be better for our character. He might sort of be impinging upon our ability to freely come to know him if he makes his existence constantly present to us. There are these kinds of responses. These are often very similar to the kind of responses that you get to the problem of evil. It's essentially just a suggestion that there might be some kind of sufficient moral warrant. For me, these responses just don't cut it. At least they seem a bit ad hoc to me. And I imagine we'll be getting into discussing a few of those. But really the argument is that if there were, I mean, you can put it quite formally as Schellenberg famously did in saying that if there is a God who exists who's perfectly loving, then non-resistant non-belief would not occur.
And what can you just, for those who haven't come across Schellenberg's version of it, what does this non-resistant bit mean?
It's an important distinction. Of course, there are non-believers who could be described as resistant to belief in God for various reasons. Maybe you're anti-theists who say, well, I don't think it's true, but I don't want it to be true. Or people who, we all know that some people in approaching certain topics will almost subconsciously, but somehow willingly, if they don't want something to be true, blind themselves to particular kinds of evidence. This is something you see on both sides of the debate. So some people like resist, right? And so if I was just like, look, I'm not going to read that nonsense. I'm not going to read the gospel. I'm not going to engage in the debate. But all of this religious stuff is ridiculous. Somebody would probably have a right to say to me, look, you're obviously not seeking properly. But the non-resistant non-believer is the person who has no objection to entering into a relationship with God, and in fact desires it. And this would be someone like myself. I think, look, if it's there, I'm here for it. I really am. I'm open to it. That is, I'm non-resistant to this belief in God. And so the reason we add that non-resistant clause is to say that is to prevent somebody from saying, well, maybe you're just sort of hardening your heart or something like this. As long as there is a single example, just one, of a truly non-resistant non-believer, then it seems that the theist needs to explain why it is that God would hide his face from them, or at least give us plausible reason to think that there could be such a reason.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a really helpful way into the argument. So, yeah, and I think we meet this in a kind of non-philosophical form quite a lot, don't we, Lucas? It's, people saying, well, I haven't, I'm open to God, but God hasn't shown up in my life. So, surely it's down to God in the end. And if God's there, then God will know what to do to make me believe and that kind of thing. So yeah, where do you start with this one?
Yeah, definitely. And I would also add, I think it's something that even the Christian or the believer can relate to, in the sense that they will experience, periods or times where they feel like, well, where is God? I can read the Bible or go to church, but it feels like there is nothing tangible or nothing relatable. So in this sense, I do think that intuitively the argument makes sense and or should make sense, I think, even to the Christian. Now, just very generally speaking, like one of the responses or one of the basic things to think about when divine hiddenness comes up is this. If, like, on what grounds are we to believe that, this one argument, if you refer to how Schellenberg put it, the argument from divine hiddenness against God's existence, in what sense are we to believe that the assertion or the perception of the skeptic or of someone like Schellenberg that there isn't enough evidence for God kind of throws out all we know from natural theology and does so objectively speaking? So it seems like you have divine hiddenness as an argument on the one side, and on the other side you have all the data you get or all the arguments you get from natural theology. And it seems like on a very basic level that the argument as such seems to kind of claim that all of this needs to be put aside, because natural theology as such is basically the claim that you look at the world as it is, you don't need special revelation, and with the data you get, you can make inference to the existence of God. So I think that's one of the basic issues that you would want to look at when the argument comes up.
So the point being that the fact that there is this objection of the hiddenness of God doesn't necessarily outweigh all of those other issues.
Exactly, because again, when you look at fine-tuning or cosmological arguments, I mean, these are ways that even atheist thinkers would say. And I mean, Alex, you've made kind of comments recently where you feel like, well, there has been raised credence in these arguments with how you've looked at them again.
Yeah.
So the question is, well, now, like, what weighs heavier? Is it the divine hiddenness argument, which basically says there is not enough evidence for a person to believe in God? Or is it the stuff that is being talked about in natural theology? So
what do you want to say to that, Alex?
Well, the divine hiddenness problem, I don't think I would characterize it as the problem that there sort of isn't enough evidence per se. It's more something about the effect that evidence has on the person who's considering belief. So, I think there's a great deal of good evidence in terms of what is argumentatively sound. The fine-tuning argument, you can make responses to it, but it's a powerful consideration. Why are the consonants so finely tuned? The argument from reason seems to be a powerful sort of undercutting reason to sort of distrust our very reasoning faculties on atheism. These kinds of things, I think they are powerful argumentatively. In a kind of academic sense, they're easy to defend and difficult to argue against. But of course, particularly for Christianity, religion is not about natural theology. Natural theology is this strange philosophical wart on the side of what is supposed to be this glorious relationship with a loving person.
I don't know if the natural theologians will appreciate being compared to a wart, but
perhaps not.
We'll let that go.
But I feel like it's such a. It seems to me, if Christianity were true, it would be the sort of wrong way to be approaching this kind of conversation.
In practice, we don't all walk around as philosophers, when we're Christians. And I've always worried slightly that maybe a lot of the non-Christians and atheists who watch these shows and yours think that, well, this must be what Christianity is. If I was a Christian, I'd just be going around quoting the ontological argument or something. And that's not quite the reality.
Well, I think it rises up as a response to sort of your intellectual atheists of history who said, look, we've got this kind of academic way of viewing the world. We like to put things in a microscope. We like to formalize and mathematize this kind of thing. And we've sort of tried to sort of taxonomize the entire world into this complete scientific understanding that if we manage to fill out, we'll explain everything. And the theist comes along and says, well, actually, I'm not so sure about that. And they start sort of arguing on those terms. And you end up with this highly academic, formalized premise conclusion, which, of course, I find interesting. I've made a career out of discussing this stuff for the past half decade. But of course, I'm an atheist, right? Like I think that this is sort of interesting from a philosophical perspective. But if I were a Christian, I would think that this is not where I would expect to find the focal point of the Christian faith. This is supposed to be about a relationship. I think, look, if God has not revealed himself through prayer or reflection or through religious experience, it'd be very bizarre indeed for me to kind of put my eye down a microscope, look at like a particular way that an atom wriggles or something, and go, there he is. It would be a very strange place for him to reveal himself. And so I wouldn't expect, so when I say that sort of the natural theological arguments, that they're argumentatively sound, I think they are, but they don't move me. And I don't think they move a lot of people. And I think if you ask people why they convert to Christianity or to theism from atheism, very rarely do they report that it's because they sat down and read a particular argument in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology.
Sometimes that is part of a wider picture. Obviously, there is some kind of intellectual questions that got answered, and then perhaps there was also an additional experience or whatever. But how would you want to respond, Lucas?
Yeah, so let me just rephrase that back to you, just in order to make sure I understand you properly. So are you basically saying that there needs to be a way to experience God, or to have like an experiential aspect to your relationship to God, rather than just an intellectual kind of wrestling and argumenting?
I went on a strange detour, but I didn't actually. I think I didn't actually quite get to the point, which is my fault. Which is that if there is a lot of evidence, the problem is not so much whether that evidence has been provided, but why that evidence doesn't move a person. Because you could provide all the evidence in the world, But if I'm just of this kind of psychological constitution where it just doesn't land with me, you could say something like, there's a sense in which you might want to say, well, that's kind of on you because there is enough evidence and you're just not accepting it for some reason. But whatever that reason is as mysterious to me as it is to you. Like, why is it that somebody will say to me, look, you have all of this evidence, you have the fine-tuning argument, you have the cosmological considerations, you have like your moral intuition, all of this kind of stuff. Like, why are you not a theist? To which I just want to say, well, that's a good question. Yeah. Why not? Why is it, indeed, that in the face of all of these supposed evidences, I am just not moved? Now, it might be something to do with me. It might be that I'm doing it wrong. It might be that I'm sort of not opening my heart to God. But I at least feel as though I've done that. And I'd like to ask any theist who thinks I'm not what they would advise that I do if they think that I've not been doing it properly. You know. But so it's not so much about the evidence, but rather the sort of lack of potency that the evidence has in actually forming a belief within a person. Okay, so I guess then we're really talking about, well, you know, a person like yourself looking at the evidence, and I think that the crucial term there is it doesn't move you. So what do you, I mean, could you kind of mention another example where the evidence moves you to, you know, to action or to whatever it's supposed to move you towards? Because I feel like, you know, I can look at, I don't know, I can look at any piece of evidence about anything, I don't know, about, you know, trees or about transportation, whatever, and not be moved by it. The question is, well, why should a piece of data or like a body of data move me to anything? I'm not trying to kind of to trick you or to undermine you in any sense, but just trying to understand, what do you understand under this term that evidence should move you? Because that's like the way I see it is that, well, you're presented with evidence, and if something makes sense to you, then the most reasonable thing is for you to act in accordance with it. I mean, take the example of smoking. I mean, it's quite out of question that smoking damages your health. So that means that, well, people should be moved to not smoke, but that's not what happens. So that the question is, or it seems to me that the problem is not with the evidence as such, which can or cannot move people to do something or to act in a certain way. So what is this moving? What do you think? I mean, I'm just curious. There are some arguments that I have experienced that have sort of moved me to change my beliefs, and it happens essentially non-consensually. This is the weird thing about becoming convinced of an argument. It just sort of happens to you, right? And so for example, when I first started considering arguments surrounding free will, when I was like 17 or something, and I'd never really thought about it, and you know, I listened to the audiobook of Sam Harris's book about free will, and I'm just kind of staring off into space like, this is incredible. And that seemed to have an effect. And I think that the reason has got something to do with, maybe if you can present a sort of valid syllogism, a deductive argument in which I sort of believe the premises, then I have no choice but to believe the conclusion. And so natural theology has a number of deductive arguments, like the Kalam cosmological argument or the ontological argument or something. And I'm when I say that these arguments are sound, and I think that they're successful, what I mean is that they're valid, that, you know, they do actually work, and that the premises sort of, they seem intuitive. We have some good reason to believe them, but of course it all rides on exactly how much credence you give to those premises. And so when you're talking about something like smoking, we have fairly well-defined parameters. We know what sort of health means. We've defined it for our own purposes. We know the effects that smoking has on a body, this kind of thing, right? But when you're talking about everything that begins to exist has a cause, sure, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Because I guess if it didn't, then, you know, wouldn't this kind of thing happen all the time? Like, maybe, but I don't know. Like, there's such a different grasp that we have on these kinds of considerations that, like, yeah, I think the argument's valid, and I think, sure, I mean, it makes sense that everything that begins to exist has a cause, but it doesn't have the same kind of undeniable force. And the only other thing is that because this is attached to a worldview that says that this is a God who is the author of the universe and has created the universe for you so that he can enjoy a relationship with you, I think I would expect something a little bit more strong than, you know, my belief that a tree is green or something, or that, you know, that this tree is 200 years old or something like that. I'd expect that if there were an argument that came along that were going to sort of push me onto theism, that the recognition that I'd actually become somewhere within me convinced that this was the case would be evidenced by the fact that I'd feel something a bit grander than the kind of experiences that would be attached to more, subtle beliefs.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, different people are obviously, there's going to be lots of factors that go into why a certain argument convinces one person but doesn't end up convincing another person, and that may not just be how sound the argument is, it might be their psychological kind of response to it and everything else, but ultimately we know that on the face of it, there are lots of people who are out there who've maybe heard a lot of the arguments, tried to kind of be as open as they can be, as Alex says he has been, Lucas, and say, but, despite all my openness and my searching and my reading of the Gospels, and even maybe I've tried to pray and just, say, God, if you're there, respond, I'm open. They say it still hasn't happened. And on that basis, they say, if God is good, if God, as you say, wants to be in relationship with people, why hasn't it happened to me? Why are there other people like me it hasn't happened to? Is this evidence, therefore, that there's not a God on the other end? And so where do you go with that? Because in simple terms, that's sort of Schellenberger's argument, I think. It's that if there are these non-resistant atheists and non-believers, God, there's no reason, he can't see any particularly good reason why God wouldn't be revealing God's self to that person.
Yeah, or not revealing himself yet. I think, and I've mentioned this like previous to our conversation, I think there is a kind of a snapshot frame of reference you can take when talking about this problem of hiddenness, by which I mean, how do I feel about God, or how do I think about God today on this 11th of July in 2022? And it seems to me, someone might say, well, God is hidden. Well, I can't experience him. Again, both the Christian or the non-Christian may actually have that sort of sentiment or feeling. But then another way to look at the whole issue is, well, you look at the period of time and, well, how has God been revealing himself to me, or have I experienced some sort of increased relationship or increased depth of relationship with God? And here is, like, I'd like to get back to kind of to your specific case, Alex, if I'm allowed to call it that. It's I looked at, recently in your conversation with Joe Schmidt, where you put up this tier list for arguments for God's existence. You mentioned, and I was struck, I thought it was quite beautiful or inspiring. You said, the ontological argument is, now I don't know if you meant it sarcastically or anything, but you said it's beautiful. And you used the word, there's something magical about it, which to me suggests something very much along the lines of, well, this actually moves me, that this does something to me. Whereas, and so I went back and checked out what you said a couple of years ago about the ontological argument, and you literally said, I don't think this is even worth the time to bring it up in a debate. And so here's what I like to suggest. And there's other things which you mentioned about other arguments in that video or in that conversation with Joe Schmidt, where I thought, and I went back and checked out other videos, and I felt like, well, there's a very stark contrast. I mean,
this is the problem with YouTube. You can check what you said, 2 or 3 years ago.
So what I'd like to suggest is, so in a certain way, when you look at these arguments, or again, the ontological argument, which you now describe as beautiful or magical, couldn't you then somehow say that when you compare where you're at now in relation to where you stood 5 years ago, dare I say, could you say that with regard to this argument, God has kind of come out of the hiding? Because it does seem beautiful to you now, and it does seem magical to you now, which it didn't a couple of years ago. So how, do you know what I mean? It's, well, I can think about God's hiddenness or God's evidence as I feel about it or think about it today, but I can also look at it how I've kind of developed and uncovered or discovered God.
We'll come back to that and hear what Alex has to say after a short break, because we take breaks here on The Unbelievable Show. And we're talking about divine hiddenness. My guests today, Lucas Ruger and Alex O'Connor. Lucas runs the Deflate YouTube channel. Alex, of course, the Cosmic Skeptic. And we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about the divine hiddenness of God. Is this a serious objection to theism? The fact that there are many people who say they're open to God, but actually they say God hasn't revealed himself to me, so therefore it's evidence that there isn't actually a God out there. I'm joined today by Lucas Ruger and Alex O'Connor. Make sure there are links to their websites and their YouTube channels in just a moment's time. We've closed the window as well here at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford, where we're recording, so that you won't hear so many cars and trucks going by in the background. But we kind of had a bit of a cliffhanger there, as Lucas asked you, Alex. Essentially, you appear to have changed your mind on some issues. You seem to take some arguments for God more seriously than you used to. And perhaps you could comment on whether you were talking seriously about the ontological argument as a beautiful argument that moves you in some way, whereas a few years ago you were prepared to say it's not worth spending any time on. So yeah, first of all, were you meaning that seriously? And does your move towards taking some of these arguments, more seriously, suggest that God may have been revealing himself to you?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think the argument is beautiful. I think it's interesting and fascinating and fiercely clever.
What changed your mind, just as a diversion?
Well,
even though Joe was insisting that no philosopher takes this seriously.
Yeah, I know. It's a tragedy. I think, as I said before on my channel, it might have a lot to do with one of my friends who's doing a PhD in the Anselmian ontological argument, and it's probably through discussing it with him, for hours upon hours, that I began to sort of take it a bit more seriously. But I really do think that, and I don't know exactly which video it was you watched, but I made a video just on the ontological argument that was maybe 2017, 2018, something like that. And I actually watched that back recently and nearly privated it because it was so bad. Like it's really bad. And the reason it's so bad is because I didn't understand it. I didn't get the argument. And it's evidenced by, for instance, there's a point where the video I'm responding to says that there's a premise that God exists in some possible world, right? And I sort of said something like, well, you can't say that actually, because, you say that God is necessary, which means he exists in either all possible worlds or no possible worlds. And so when you say this premise that God exists in some possible world, then, that can't be the case, because he can't exist in just some possible world. He has to exist in all or none. And this is confusion. I didn't get why the argument was taking this form. Obviously something had gone wrong in my head. And so, of course, at the time, I think that sounds ridiculous, because, of course, saying if it's possible that God exists, then God exists sounds ridiculous,
sure,
right? If you don't sort of understand what the argument's driving at. And so, okay, a lot of people have said to me, look, you really need to revisit this. So I do, and I look at it and I think, wow, this is actually quite interesting. This is quite powerful. I wouldn't say that sort of God has come out from hiding here. This is an example of me misunderstanding an argument, and then upon understanding it, thinking that it's very clever. And I don't think my view on how good it is has changed since then. Now, you could still say, well, here's still evidence of an argument that's put forward, which at first you say, that does nothing for me, it's ridiculous. And now you're saying, it's quite good. But this is kind of the problem all over again, because, sure, I didn't understand the argument at first. It's not like that was my fault. At least I don't think it was my fault. I was a teenager and I was trying to look at sort of the logic of possibilities, and I just didn't get it. And so maybe part of the reason why I was an atheist back then was because I'd heard an argument like that and I thought it's ridiculous. Now, maybe that's because of my misunderstanding, but even then, even if that is the case, it's like, what could I have done there? What could I have done differently? So maybe God just has good reason to sort of allow me to be mistaken, so that then in the future I become sort of a theist, and then maybe it's something to do with that journey that actually sort of shows people that, if they're experiencing doubts, that maybe that this is something that happens to people. But then there are all kinds of problems that are raised by that. For example, the problem of believing in libertarian free will as a theist. If you're the kind of theist that thinks that sort of my acceptance of the sacrifice of Jesus is somehow necessary to my salvation, then as long as you believe that there are sort of free human beings who are actually able to do what they like, then sure, maybe God has some grand plan whereby, I'm not a theist, and then 10 years in the future I become a theist, and this has some great sort of practical import. But maybe 4 years into that, somebody sort of freely chooses to come and murder me. Somebody hits me with their car or something like that. And so I never actually make it that far. There seems to be a bit of a problem here for me, which is that, well, if the reason why I wasn't a theist at the moment of my death was because God was doing something himself, was sort of purposefully trying to enact this plan where I eventually become a theist one day, but this gets interrupted because of the existence of free will, and so I end up going to the afterlife not saved, That seems incredibly unfair. Okay, so maybe God sort of knows what I would have done had that not happened, in which case I kind of ask why it needed to be done at all in the first place. I understand that this could be an argument. It could be like, well, look, yeah, I know that you don't feel God's presence, and I know that he's not making himself known to you, but he's doing that on purpose. It seems strange to me to put that in the same argument or in the same position against this problem as saying that, but look, there is all of this evidence, there is all of this natural theology that you're sort of ignoring or not understanding or rejecting, but then also saying that actually, no, the reason that you don't feel God is because God has good reason to sort of hide himself from you. These seem to rub up against each other, as well as, of course, the scripture seems to be littered with references to the idea that people should be able to believe in God. You know, the fool in his heart says there is no God. Romans 1 is a famous example of people saying that this is God saying that essentially the evidence that's been provided to everybody is such that they are without excuse for not having belief in him. I don't mind somebody saying, yeah, that's what Romans 1 means, and it's correct that there is enough evidence for everybody, and you're just somehow missing it or ignoring it or something. Or somebody saying, you know, that there actually isn't enough evidence that's been provided to you, and God has good reason for that. But I don't think you can do both at once.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's have a few responses then to some of those thoughts.
There was a lot there. I think just as a comment on the side, I don't know whether it makes sense for us to go in. I mean, I understand where you're coming from by saying, well, if God would allow me to kind of wrestle with all this stuff and all the arguments without coming to believe, and the grand plan is this and that, but maybe it can get messed up. I mean, I guess that's a slightly different question regarding divine providence or how God orders the world and all of that stuff. All I was trying to say is that by looking at your own kind of development or the way you've come, I mean, even emotionally, you yourself said, in your recent debate with Jonathan McLatchie that a couple of years ago you were among those resistant skeptics or non-believers who would have said, or who said, well, even if I knew or believed that God existed, or the Christian God at least, I wouldn't want to worship him. Whereas now you are saying of yourself that I'd happily worship him, actually, and I would love to be the recipient of unconditional divine grace. So to me, this seems to suggest that maybe, well, yes, there is certainly a problem of divine hiddenness, and there is certainly this intuitive perception both Christians and non-Christians have that, well, I would like to experience God more, but he just doesn't seem to be out there. Again, I would like to be moved, but I just can't get there. But then maybe there is also the sense of, well, maybe that there is the role you yourself play in hiding from God. You know what I mean? By saying, well, again, back then I didn't want to worship God even if I knew that he existed. Whereas now, again, in this sense, I'm saying, well, maybe you yourself have come out of the hiding, if that's kind of a proper use of terms. And again, I understand that you might say, well, what was my fault back then for thinking about God or thinking about worshiping God that way, and yet again, I would say that, well, this gets us into a discussion about free will and
I mean, just for the record, in that sense, Alex, do when you say you're a non-resistant, I mean, at one time would you have said, as Lucas seems to be saying, that actually you would have said, no, if God is there, especially the Christian God, I wouldn't want to worship that God, and I would, in a sense, you acknowledged your resistance. You in a different place now, and then the next question, I suppose, is how could you even tell that? Because most of our psychology and motivations aren't often open to us anyway. How would you know that you are genuinely non-resistant and so on? But
that's true. Of course, no one can have full confidence that they know what they would actually do in a situation so grand as being faced with God. I think it would take a rather brave atheist indeed, or I guess they wouldn't be an atheist anymore, to reject what, if Christianity is true, just sort of would be morally justifiable and true on grounds that you somehow have better epistemic access to ethics, which you may indeed have none at all if you have nothing to ground it in. I think it's quite strange. I think, I was quite sort of wrapped up in not just the theism is false, but also theism is terrible and horrible and needs to be eliminated because it's just this disgusting tyrannical force.
Anti-theism.
Yeah, more or less. You end up kind of joining a team, right? And if you start making YouTube videos, as I did, about atheism, and you say, this is why I think, you know, that there might be no God, and then you find other people doing the same thing, but you find that a lot of them are sort of saying that religion is really bad and very evil. This is just kind of what happens to people if you start listening to a certain form of content. It's quite strange as well, because it's usually a peripheral things. That's why you find it quite strange that if you know somebody's views on one thing, you can often work out what their views are on something else. If I know your views on abortion, I might be able to work out your views on gun rights. You know, it's like, why is that? Well, maybe it's because there's sort of something on the periphery. And it's not always so direct. It's just because if you're listening to somebody who's super pro-life in America, and you listen to loads and loads of pro-life sources, like, I don't know, something about the algorithm or something about the guests they have on, just something and without even noticing, you just start slowly sort of accepting this pro-gun rhetoric. And the same thing happens with theism and atheism, right? If you become an atheist, on the periphery, there's this sociological critique of religion, which I was quite swept up in. I remain agnostic now on the usefulness of religion. I've said before that I think saying religion is bad is like saying politics is bad. It's like, yeah, but that doesn't really tell us very much. I mean, most Christians would probably think that religion of many forms is quite bad, right? And so it's quite vague. But I certainly wouldn't say that like it would be a bad thing for there to be something like a Christian God who existed.
And so the next question: how certain are you that you are non-resistant? That if God is there, then you're not putting up any barriers?
Well, I suppose as certain as I can be, to give you a rather boring answer. There's something that needs to be worked out here in terms of how hard a person needs to try. If I did nothing, if I just kind of sat around and said, look, you know, God, come and find me, maybe you'd say, look, you need to do a bit of searching. Yeah. But I don't think I could be expected to sort of be, you know, on my knees multiple times a day, like begging high heavens to give me a sign, or to dedicate my entire life to studying philosophy and theology, even though, of course, I have actually ended up doing that, which is why I say I think I've actually gone, although I'm not sure exactly sort of how much I should be expected to do, I think I've gone further than wherever that line may be. But of course you can do this stuff with the wrong sort of heart, as it were. Like you can go into studying a degree in theology with the express purpose of trying to undermine it or something like that, which, you know, may well have been sort of what was running through my head at the beginning of the degree. I'm not sure, it's actually quite hard to remember, but certainly now I think to myself, look, I live with Christians, and I made that decision purposefully to try to consistently engage them as people who are my friends. So not in like a debate, not where you're trying to one-up each other in front of an audience, but where you just sit down and have a conversation with your friends. You know, I read scripture, I go to Bible study groups and this kind of thing.
You do more than many Christians do, frankly.
I try my best. I mean, I still don't do as much as I could. You know, like there are books of the Bible that I haven't read. You know, this kind of thing. But I think, look, I can't put my finger on this, but I feel like I'm doing what would be expected.
So as your conscience is clean, that as far as, you know, within reason, you're looking, searching, you don't think that you've got a kind of axe to grind against God at this point. And I think we just have to take that at face value, Lucas, right?
I very much think so, yes.
Even if you don't believe me, you can just imagine that there's at least one person who does act like that.
No, I do. And I mean, in general, I mean, you're not the first person who tells me that, you know, I'm really trying, and I would love for there to be a God, and I try to touch base with him. And again, I read scripture, and I go to Bible studies, and I pray, or I listen to worship music and whatnot. Yes, I do take that at face value. It's not, you know, I feel quite awkward saying, well, maybe there's something psychological going on, other than the only thing that I would have to admit is that, well, even with me, there is psychological stuff going on as a Christian. You know, I too want Christianity to be true. There are underlying reasons why I do certain Christian things which I'm unaware of. And I thought it was quite interesting in your, you quoted, I think to Jonathan, you quoted Psalm 139,
yes,
which is about the presence of God. Where can I go from you? And if I make myself, if I go to the ends of the earth, you are there and whatnot. And the Psalm ends with the psalmist saying, well, oh God, search my heart, oh God, and know my thoughts,
yes,
try me and see if there's any grievous way within me and lead me in the way everlasting. And, in between that end and the beginning, which you quote, there's this really messy 3 verses where he talks about, I hate those who hate you. And it's just, you feel like, wow, what's going on here? And then it ends on this note where the psalmist himself, it's as if he becomes aware that he may not be fully in control of what is actually going on. And I think that's why it's so important that Scripture mentions, that Paul mentions in Romans, that we should be renewed in our minds. Because again, we seem to be not always quite aware of why we're doing things. And the roots of decision making go very, very deep into depths that we can't grasp. So in this sense, I would definitely say, what you say, Alex, you've tried your best. And yes, I do think you've come to great lengths with all your studies and interactions and whatnot. Yes, I don't think it's fair for me to say, well, maybe there is, something else going on.
But are you ultimately coming to the view, Lucas, that no one can ultimately know? Then there might still be. It's always possible that there is some kind of resistance within any individual because we can't know.
I do think, but again, if I was going to say that to Alex, I was only going to say by also adding that, well, I'm in that same boat.
We're all in the same boat.
I'm in that same boat.
I think you might be committed to that view, but it's certainly not something I take personally. It's quite a powerful rhetorical tool, actually, if you're debating somebody and they say, well, look, are you sure you're sort of searching properly? And it's, how dare you, I've done this, I've done that, and you start reeling things off as if it's not possible to do these things, as I say, for the purpose of undermining them. I mean, look, my job is to discuss religion broadly, at least one part of it, and to do it from a critical aspect. So it's like, well, of course you sort of read Gospels and live with Christians to get an idea of how they think so that you can better sort of undermine them, this kind of thing. Like, it's possible the person can do that. I don't think that's what I'm doing. I really don't. But I understand why somebody might be committed to the view that that's what I'm doing, at least in some part. It doesn't mean that I'm sort of knowingly sort of deceiving everybody I know and myself. There might just be sort of a more subtle motivation at play. But of course, I don't think you're exactly even in control of those motivations. That it's complicated because there's a sense in which there's also a sort of atheistic vested interest that goes into sort of wanting to sin. Christians often say, atheists just want to sin. I mean, this is true. Of course, it's true. Even from a Christian picture, everybody wants to sin.
Is this the view, if I could put it this way, that some Christians may say, well, it's not just about changing a belief, it's about changing a lifestyle. And therefore there's going to be a psychological sort of cost and a social cost to becoming a Christian. Therefore, that's bound to weigh on whether an atheist ultimately decides to cross that line.
And it's often implied that to experience the fullness of faith, you need to walk the walk. That is, God will reveal himself once you start living a pious life. We're sort of often told that, like, if you live the life of a Christian, then you might start feeling the fulfillment.
If you act it out, then it might start to suddenly become real.
This to me is no surprise. This is just how human psychology works. I'm sure that if I started going to masjid and praying 5 times a day and hanging out with my Muslim friends all of the time and reading Muslim literature all the time, I'd probably become my credence in Islam would probably be increased. Similarly, if I got you to sort of hang out with nobody but vegans for the next month and read nothing but vegan literature and watch factory farm footage.
I mean, just going to lunch with you, I practically came out as a vegan, Alex. So,
it's probably going to increase your credence, right? This is how human psychology works. And so it's no surprise to me that if I were to start living the life of a Christian, I'd probably start finding it a bit more plausible. Fine. But it has to be the other way around here. Of course, there are sins and there are sins, right? There are sins that even just in a sort of colloquial sense, I'm not saying that I'm going to keep going around like murdering people, but I mean, there are certain things that are considered sins which can really maybe only be made sense of as sins if you've already accepted the truth of Christianity. It's difficult to put my finger on it. It might include things like lying in certain circumstances, or it might include like casual sex, or think things of this sort, which people might engage in and think, not just think, well, I know this is a bit sinful, but I'm not a Christian, but thinking, I just don't see anything wrong with this, unless maybe Christianity is true. And even then, I'm not sure quite why it's wrong, but I guess I'd be willing to accept that.
The person that's often quoted on this, Lucas and Alex, you're probably familiar with this, is Thomas Nagel. There's a famous passage in one of his books where he says, the thing is, I don't want it to be true. And I'm troubled by the number of intelligent people I know who do believe in God and Christianity and so on. And that's often used to say, well, look, there's obviously a kind of motivational bias going on very often in this. And Alex, hearing what Alex has to say there, does that help at all, Lucas, in the kind of sense of could those kinds of, well, I want to be able to have sex who I want with, and not sort of follow some specific biblical code. Is that going to make a difference in your view to whether people actually are open?
Well, yeah, definitely. I definitely think there are those kinds of people to whom this plays a big role. Thomas Nagel called this the cosmic authority problem. And he said, I think it's quite pervasive and bears quite a bit of the responsibility for the reductionism of our time. That's how he ends, how the quote ends. And
he was kind of being very honest in that sort of moment, wasn't he?
Definitely. And then there is Aldous Huxley who made specific reference to sexual morality. He said that, well, the liberation from the meaning that Christianity is supposed to give was for many of those in our generation a way to have a more sexually liberal lifestyle. So yes, I definitely do think that this is the case with some people. I've had people come to me and say that, I knew that Christianity is true, or people from a Muslim background who went into New Age and just crazy stories. They felt that God supernaturally revealed himself to them, actually. And so this girl came to me and said, well, Lucas, I knew Christianity to be true way before I actually committed to Christ. But it's because I was aware of the cost that was required in terms of my sexual lifestyle that I didn't want to commit. So I do think, yes, there are those people. But again, as far as I know you, Alex, again, that's why I'm very apprehensive to say, well, maybe there is some of this going on underneath the surface. Yeah. Well, I don't think that's fair.
I can tell you that there is to a degree, which is, as I say, only in those areas where I might be engaging in things which would be sinful if Christianity were true, but it's difficult to make sense of being wrong if there is no sort of moral authority. Not to imply. So I gave the example of casual sex. I think that casual sex is quite a dangerous thing. It's quite an overrated thing. It's like people don't treat it as seriously as they should. But equally, in other contexts, treat it like way more seriously than anything else on planet Earth. It's quite strange that it's sort of everything and nothing at the same time. It's a difficult thing to sort of make sense of. But certainly, sex before marriage, or if I were homosexual, right, engaging in homosexual sexual activity, or even just homosexual, relationship. It would be the kind of thing where I'd think to myself, well, look, if Christianity were true and for some reason this was wrong, and I wouldn't understand why, look, Christianity is such a wonderful, incredible, just eternity altering thing that sure, I'll happily
You'd
just
be happy to give it up.
But if somebody's like, yeah, you need to walk the walk and then it will become revealed to you, it's like, and until I'm pretty much certain that that's the case, it's going to be very difficult for me to justify giving
the
cost
that
isn't
up, going to be worth the potential benefit.
And that's unlike, if somebody's like sort of engaging in sinful activity that's sort of maybe they're like a drunkard or something, and they think to themselves, well, if there's no God, there's not exactly a reason why this should be like wrong per se, but they sort of feel there's something off about that, right? These kind of things, it's a bit easier to say, well, look, if you start sort of living a bit more piously, then Christianity will reveal itself to you. But with these kinds of things, it seems more difficult for me.
Yeah, and I don't think it's right to say that, well, unless you walk the walk, that God won't reveal himself to you. There's people who felt, God's presence or experienced something even supernatural, even without having walked the walk, whereby, I would say by sheer grace, God did reveal himself. And they felt something without having done anything, without having committed to anything prior to that experience. I'd like to, I don't know if this is going to be helpful, but I'd like to kind of throw in Paul Draper's perspective on this. I thought it was very interesting. I don't know what you think about it, Alex. He's of course the state-of-the-art example of an agnostic who sits on the fence, who says that, well, the evidence really just points both ways, and I can't make up my mind whether it's naturalism or theism. And yet he goes on to say in one of his essays, he says, well, I think as an agnostic who does sit exactly on the fence, it is, and he uses the term rationally required for me to engage in religious activity, prayer or scripture reading or what have you. And then he goes on to say that this may actually, and here's an important distinction I think he causes us to make. He says, well, this may actually lead to a relationship with God, even if it doesn't lead to belief in God. And I think, these are some, like we were talking about belief and relationship, or about these things in a technical term. If belief is, this propositional attitude of holding something to be true or to be the case, he says, well, you can have a relationship with God even if you don't have that propositional attitude of belief. But, or what other people would say, like acceptance, that is acting as if something is true, may actually lead to relationship to God. And maybe the kind of the difference between the two is, again, belief is what we mean by that, at least philosophically speaking, is, again, you hold something to be true. Whereas acting as if something is true, that is acceptance, is quite a different ballgame. You can accept something even if you don't believe in it. Let's say your brother is kidnapped and you feel, you have good evidence that he was also killed, but because of the great good that it would be for him to still live and for you to be reunited with him, you act as if it's true that he's still alive. So you go and search for him, or you do whatever campaigning you need to do in order to try and find him. So you act as if it's true that your brother lives, even though you don't actually believe that he lives.
Yeah.
And so Draper is kind of making this case that you can, because for him it is still a real possibility that God does exist. He says, well, I think it's a good thing for me to act as if this is true. And he goes on to say that this may actually, it can lead to relationship with God, provided that God exists. Of course, if God doesn't exist, if he turns out to not exist, well, there is not going to be any relationship. But I can act as if it's true that he exists. And if he happens to exist, I can develop a relationship.
It's almost a bit of a Pascal's wager, almost, isn't it?
It goes a bit into that. And then he goes on to say that, and so this is, I want to say this cautiously to you, Alex, because I know of the great efforts you've done already. He says that, well, maybe for some people, belief may not actually be the primary gateway to relationship with God, but some people, because again of our different psychological wirings, some of us may actually have to struggle and to wrestle and to be satisfied at first with acting as if it's true that God exists and get into a relationship with him that way, instead of entering through belief already.
And as you've said, there are many Christians, I think, who struggle with doubt, who say, my belief in God goes up and down all the time, but I live, but I have to just live this life where actually I believe that whether or not I'm feeling at this moment that God exists, I'm going to trust that God exists, and so on. So belief is sometimes a bit of a difficult thing to say, well, that's what it is, and that's what means God is there or has revealed himself to you. There may be, I guess, on what Lucas is saying, some sense in which you may not even have a belief in God, but still there's a possibility of some kind of relationship with God even in the absence of that belief.
Yeah, but this is what I was talking about a moment ago, which is we have to offer an analysis of what it means to sort of live as if this were true. Because, okay, so I can live as if it were true that I should love my enemies and that I should be compassionate and that sort of love is the basic truth of the universe. Okay, but that doesn't seem adequate to live as if Christianity were true. It would also mean that I would have to stop committing these things which I described earlier as sort of sins if Christianity were true. Things which I can only even conceptually begin to understand as in any way wrong if Christianity is already true. And so if we're saying something like, well, look, as an agnostic, maybe a good idea is to live as if this is true, because then if it is true, you manage to enter into this relationship even without the belief, then it gets only worse, because now you'd be asking me, for instance, if I were gay, to give up homosexual relationships, not even because then I'll be able to finally believe in God. But no, you still won't. You still won't believe any of it's true, but you'll still be sort of living this life as if it's true in the hopes that one day maybe the fact that you've entered into a relationship with a being who isn't sort of willing to demonstrate that he's even in that relationship with you.
I guess
I feel like that would be a lot to ask of a person. You know what I mean?
I suppose the question isn't though whether it's a lot to ask of a person, but whether it in principle could be the case that people who say I haven't had God revealed to me could nevertheless still be in a relationship with God. I suppose it's just asking, are there people, is there a scenario in which actually the belief has to be there in order for God
but if,
to be...
if the kind of resistance involved in making somebody be best described as like a resistant non-believer or somehow sort of not in a relationship with God because of something that they're doing, if that something that they're doing is something like an unwillingness to give up a very important part of their life that they can't see as wrong or sinful until they've already accepted the truth of the proposition, I don't think that's fair. I think that's quite cruel. I don't know what you I'm not exactly sure what the kind of point you're trying to put forward is, but if I try to sort of trace this conversation, it was something like we were talking about, you know, there are sort of motivations for believing one way or the other, you know, and one of the atheist motivations might be that they just want to sin. And as I said a moment ago, like, I do think that's true because everybody wants to sin. That's the problem of sin. That's for Christians. The whole thing is that everybody wants to sin so much that they unavoidably do. Okay, so I say, well, maybe it's because, you know, but then there are certain sins which are only sins really if Christianity is true. And it would be weird to ask me to sort of give those up. Yeah. And then maybe, you know, I'll achieve this Christianity thing. And then it seems like Lucas said, well, no, I'm not saying that you need to sort of walk the walk and then God reveals himself to you. But maybe if you sort of do walk the walk, you'll be able to enter into a relationship with him without even knowing it. It's like, is that what you're recommending people like me do? Are you just making that like a conceptual point that it's like possible to enter into a relationship? Because if you're saying that this is what someone in my position should do, then I think you're probably asking too much of me.
Well, we'll have a response and then we'll have to start to wrap it up, guys.
Yeah. Well, the point I was trying to make with regards to God revealing himself as soon as someone starts to walk the walk. Maybe that wasn't clear enough or I was being too simplistic. I do think that in certain cases this may be the case, but I reacted against the claim that this is how it works. Because again, I think God interacts with different people in different ways. So it can be that he'll ask of someone, if you want, to walk the walk first or to act as if Christianity is true before he lets them feel something or like have an experience of him in this sense. Whereas for other people, it will be the case that, you know, he lets them feel something or have an experience of the divine before they've done anything really. So this is not for me to know or to judge like what case applies to what person. What I am, and I'm also not saying and I think this is, I mean, because of my theological commitments, I would never say that if you just accept, again, in the technical sense, Christianity, that is, you act as if it's true without believing and you get into a relationship with God, well, this will be enough. I do think, I mean, I wouldn't be comfortable holding that position. I mean, the scripture does say that in the end, it's faith that saves. So there is, and to faith, there is certainly a belief component. You know, it's certainly trust in Christ or trust in the truth of Christianity, trust in God. But with that comes a belief component. That is, well, I at least believe, I hold it to be true that God exists and that Christ is, you know, was revealed in the flesh. So I'm not saying that acceptance, acting as if Christianity is true, is going to be the end of the road. What I'm trying to say is that for some people, and again, that's why I'm saying I don't want this to sound too harsh on you personally. I do think that for some people, this may be the way to go, or this may be the thing, kind of the leap of faith that God is asking someone to take before he lets them experience him, in the sense that, well, you know, even if you're saying, well, there are certain sins that are only considered sins if I accept Christianity to be true, well, maybe, and again, I mean, this is very hypothetical. I don't want to kind of under the surface try to point my finger at anything, not at all. But maybe what God is asking a person like you to take the leap of faith and say, well, I actually let go of this, and I truly act as if Christianity is true. I truly kind of take on the Christian proposition that this stuff is not good, and I ought not to do it. You know what I mean? So this is but this may be that kind of the leap of faith that applies to
I mean,
that. And also, let me just point out that I find it significant that there is this wrestling with God, like a theme of wrestling with God or with the divine that you find in Scripture. It's Jacob who wrestles with God and is called Israel, one of the meanings of which is, well, the one who struggles and wrestles with God. There is this line you find in Scripture, this thread of people not finding God directly through, oh wow, this all makes sense, the evidence is crystal clear to me, yes, sure, I'll be happy to commit, and they may even have had an experience or whatnot. There is this thread of other people not really finding God that way, but just really struggling with it.
We will go to a final break, and we'll conclude our conversation in just a moment. We're talking about the hiddenness of God. My guests today are Lucas Ruger and Alex O'Connor. Links to their YouTube channels with today's show as well. And we'll be back in just a moment. Really interesting conversation today on divine hiddenness. And it's been so good to have it in person here at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford. A wonderful place to come and study for ordination if you're thinking of going in that direction. And thanks again to Max Baker-Hitch, who has given us the use of this lovely room on a very warm July day. But we're looking forward to having the windows open in a moment. But Alex, I mean, as we start to conclude this conversation, we talked about, the fact that you feel you are genuinely open as you can be. Luke is still saying, but, sometimes the journey of faith is not just about God revealing himself to people, but it's about some long, struggle with God. And ultimately you only see, the big picture in the end and so on. And who knows, maybe that is just the way it is for some people, and that they're not going to be given, this clear evidence that they feel they're owed if there is a God out there. And ultimately it might involve something like, as he says, a kind of trying on of Christianity, a leap of faith that is costly at some level, but for some reason that's part of what God intends for you in the end. So where do you go with all that?
I don't like to think of divine hiddenness as a response to theism as much as I like to think of theism as a response to divine hiddenness. I think that on an atheistic picture of the universe, of consciousness essentially arising by accident, we don't sort of know what we're doing here. We developed this faculty for asking why, because it's somehow beneficial. And we sort of look at the night sky, and we look at the stars, and we look at the grandiosity of the whole thing, and we say, look, what's going on here? And there's nothing. There's no answer. There's no indication. There's no reason for it. And so, existential dread isn't something that was invented by the existentialists. Something that probably preceded all religious thought and may have been one of the reasons why it developed. It's not surprising to me, in other words, to find religious scripture littered with people struggling with their inability to find God, and only after a sort of long series of intellectual and practical sacrifice are they able to discover him. Maybe that is what it takes, but maybe that says more about faith than it does about the person. Maybe, it is the case that, okay, speaking poetically, what God asks of me to reveal himself to me is that I essentially throw caution to the wind and just begin to act like a Christian. And that's not true of everybody. That's just true of someone like me, maybe. Now, why might that be the case? Well, maybe because for somebody else, natural theology is enough to make them go, you know what? Yeah, that makes sense. And I think I'm going to be a Christian now. Okay, fine. And that person's perfectly content because now they're happy. They have an explanation. They have a sort of meaning in their life, sure. And for someone like me, I look at these arguments and I think, yeah, they make sense, but they're just kind of not doing it for me. So somebody says, well, maybe it's because you're resistant. It's like, okay, sure. So then you try to be as non-resistant as possible. You try to engage in sort of Christian literature and debate and argument, even if you're not living like a Christian, but you're being non-resistant at the very least. And then you still feel nothing. And someone comes along and says, okay, well, then why don't you just try sort of acting as if it were true, right? You've tried sort of being convinced, but you weren't. Now you've tried being sort of obsessively open about being convinced and it hasn't worked. Now be so obsessively open that you're just going to actually pretend as if it's true and just act as if it's true. And then maybe, you'll start to see it as true. It's like, well, no surprise. But to me, this seems like a big cope. This seems like looking at the universe, receiving absolutely no answer, not understanding why we're here, and palpably tripping over ourselves to try to make something like this work, to make ourselves feel better about ourselves. And I hate to downplay it so much, but this is unfortunately just the sort of atheistic view of what religion is. It's a now, that's not to say, now a lot of people say that makes it a bad thing. There's obviously a reason why this has developed. There's obviously a reason why this is sort of universally sprung up among human cultures. Maybe not sort of religion or theism per se, but some sort of feeling of transcendence or numinous. Like, it obviously serves some kind of purpose, right? And of course that can be perverted into becoming a horrible tool for social injustice or whatever. But like, you know, in principle, there's obviously something that this does for the human soul. But as I say, I think we've kind of got it the wrong way around. It's not like we have this thing called theism and we're saying, here's this thing that lots of people believe, but like, oh, well, here's a problem that we hadn't thought of. Why is God not sort of making himself evident to us? I think it's the other way around. We have this kind of emptiness and nihilism and suffering and meaninglessness, which, you know, it helps to believe in a God. And that desire is so fundamental, is so sort of deep within a human being. It's sort of almost pre-intellectual, that of course we're going to be able to try all different kind of tricks to make this work for us. And so I also don't think it's surprising. You know, a lot of people say I'm very troubled by the fact that there are lots of very smart people who believe this kind of stuff. For a start, a lot of those smart people are sort of really smart scientists or incredible poets and writers and musicians, and they all believe in God. It's like, okay, you can have incredible intelligence in one area and just be totally unknowledgeable about another, but also incredibly intelligent philosophers. But as I say, even then, I don't think like philosophy is the most appropriate mechanism to God, if there is in fact a God. Like, sure, these people are academics and they sort of wear shirts and suits and they show up to debates and they bring their books and, you know, all this kind of stuff. But when they get home and take off their clothes and get in the shower, they're still just like a confused ape who, you know, wants comfort from the universe that's giving them absolutely no reason as to why they should be getting out of bed in the morning. So it's no surprise to me that, you know, all of this development, of course, like the very development of intellectual thought and writing books and having conversations, all of that kind of stuff is itself an outgrowth of something that about doing that's going to help us to survive or make us sort of socially more beneficial. And so if religion is in the same category, it wouldn't surprise me that people are sort of, that underneath there somewhere there's something about this longing for some answer that causes them to invent these kind of deities and defend them to the ends of the earth.
Well, we've gone back about 100,000 years there with that conclusion from Alex. Where do you want to begin?
Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts there. I think the question here as well, is it possible to take kind of the scenario you presented or the narrative you presented a step back by saying, I mean, you're essentially saying, so theism is an answer or a response to hiddenness, you know, the hiddenness of meaning or the lack of meaning we seem to see ourselves confronted with. Well, but then the question is also, well, why do we sense that in the first place? You know, why, if there was no meaning to the universe, why did we even find, you know, this piece of meaning that the universe is meaningless? So I guess the question then becomes, well, what do you take to be ultimate? Or where do you start your narrative? Is it, you know, do you feel, well, you know, we came up with theism and with philosophy and poetry and all of that in response to what you could call divine hiddenness or meaninglessness? Or is the fact that we're actually asking these questions not a pointer to, you know, the truth that there is actually meaning to be found? Because otherwise, why again would we have come up with, you know, why would we have come up with this meaningful view or proposition that there is no meaning in the first place? That's one thing I would say in response. And the other thing I would say is, again, I think, or I want to challenge you not to be too hard, I don't know, not too hard on yourself or on God for that matter, for saying, well, there is no answer, because I do think that you, in some ways, your journey testifies to the fact that you have found certain answers, or at least certain answers have started to maybe click more or to make more sense. And then I guess, and that's maybe a good note to end on, like I wonder on your behalf, like, okay, how long, O Lord, like as the psalmist says in Psalm 13, you know, how long will you hide from me? And that's an answer, I mean, I cannot give. I can certainly see that there is, and again, this may sound super like patronizing or like harsh to hear it from me, but I can certainly see that there is, with your struggle and people, I mean, thousands of people kind of like witnessing it, I mean, there is like immense good, I believe, that comes out for people who are forced to think about their lives much more deeply and think about God for that matter, and Christianity for that matter, much more deeply. And so I understand that this sounds like, well, you know, you're being sacrificed here on the altar of people finding meaning and a deeper, you know, sense of faith or experience of God. But there may be, I just wonder whether this may be some aspect to the journey you're on.
I mean, maybe you're the next Apostle Paul, you know, and it's your your wonderful conversion straight after this show, Alex. Which finally, you know,
all I'm asking for is something just like what Paul experienced. I tell you, Justin, if I experience even just in the form of a flash of light, like St. Paul, although, you know, dubious circumstances, I have to say, but even something just like that, just once, just one time. Listen, here I am. And then gone. I could live on that for the rest of my entire life. Just because a lot of people say, well, one reason why God is hiding himself is because if he made himself, you know, constantly present in your life, it would be like having a father figure staring over your shoulder. I agree, but I'm not asking for God to sort of hold my hand through this lived experience. I'm asking once. Okay. And not even for like an overwhelming religious experience with a big waterfall and, you know, I fall to my knees, but just enough to form a belief that he exists. If I can have just that, just once, then I'll become the most prolific Christian apologist that you've ever met.
You heard it here. Lucas and Alex, thank you. It's been a really, really interesting conversation. And I hope you've enjoyed watching it wherever you're watching from. Thanks again to Wycliffe Hall for hosting us for this special conversation that's been recorded here in Oxford on a hot July day, and to Max Baker Hitch as well. And we thank you for watching. Do go and check out the websites and indeed the YouTube channels. They're linked with today's show, Deflate and Cosmic Skeptic. But for now, from all three of us, goodbye.